Your Most Avid Reader by Bibi Berkey. Dear Monica, may I address you so informally? In fact, may I ask if that's your real name at all? So many writers have pseudonyms, don't they? And I thought perhaps you might write under another name for another type of book, and that, being such an avid reader of your work, I might have the pleasure of finding other sublime stories to enjoy. Wouldn't that be wonderful? You must have gathered, reading only so far, that I'm a huge fan of your work. I sometimes wonder if I might be your most avid reader, though how such a thing would be measured, I don't know. If they come up with a device for gauging a reader's enthusiasm, I'd like to volunteer myself to give it a test run. I really ought to get to the point. Sorry. I was wondering if you have a moment to explain how you came up with such a splendid idea. To write a series of novels with the same protagonists, but with each book set in a different historical era. To have a love story spanning British history is truly inspired. But what makes it so gripping, of course, is the fact that they so often brush past each other, Dominic and Marianne, without one even knowing the other is there. It's sheer agony for the reader, but so compelling. I often keep talking to them in my head long after I've shut the book. Making them pursue each other through time is about as thrilling a literary device as I've come across. Having said that, the idea is not enough, and a certain quality of writing, which you seem to produce effortlessly, is equally important to the mix. As a mere reader, I have no right to make suggestions, but I'm emailing you because I'm gripped by an idea that I think might be useful as you plan your next instalment. You almost certainly have many, many plot lines sorted out long before you begin writing your books, so I appreciate that a suggestion from me might be more irritating than helpful. I won't go into detail here in case you're not inclined to hear it. My idea, I think, could lift Dominic and Marianne into an intriguing new world, at the same time presenting the reader with a fascinating and controversial period of British history. Would you hear me out? A brief note to let me know one way or another would be appreciated. Of course, if you find my ideas lame or insulting to your intelligence, then we'll leave things there. I'll be satisfied with reading your excellent books. Sometimes a person gets an overinflated view of her usefulness and needs to be knocked down to size. I apologise for any unwelcome assumptions on my part. With best wishes from your most avid reader, Hilary Keeler.
Dear Miss Keeler, thank you for your letter and your kind words. It's always a thrill to hear from someone who loves my books. It's what makes me carry on writing. I do hope you will enjoy the next instalment of the Clement Street series. With best wishes, Monica Malone.
Dear Monica, please forgive me for writing to you again, but I do it with the belief that maybe you didn't actually read my first email. Perhaps the number of letters and emails you receive is so overwhelming that you employ someone to read them for you, and mine got lost in the mass of adulation. It's not hard to find your email address, by the way, otherwise I wouldn't have been so bold as to approach you like this. I totally understand if you'd rather not have anything to do with me. However, if on the off chance you never read my email, may I just mention what I think might be an interesting development for Dominic and Marianne? I think it'll bring even more suspense into your already galloping plot lines. My other point was the boring old question I imagine you get asked all the time. I wondered how you dreamt up the idea for the series. Did it just arrive in a flash? And so once again I sign myself off, accurately, your most avid reader, Hilary.
Dear Miss Keeler, yes, I'm afraid you're right. I get far too many emails these days to address each one in person, and so my assistant must do it for me. Most, as I'm afraid you've discovered, get a stock reply. In fact, your second email would have suffered the same fate had my assistant not randomly opened it and sent it to me with a "What shall I do with this?" I read it and found that I had to respond. You ask about how I came to create the Clement Street series, and how I go about it. I knew I didn't wish to put my characters into well-known historical situations, like the Great Fire of London or the suffragist movement. No, I was determined to pick less well-known events and to enter them entirely. This way, I could bring to readers not only a compelling ongoing love story, but also a lost slice of life. I researched the obscurer sides of our shared past. I wish to surprise. I wish to reveal. But I cannot deny that after 5 books, I'm beginning to wonder what area to explore next. And no, my mind is not banked up with plot lines, as you suggest. But never mind, something always crops up. It's a delightful enterprise to unearth the new or the forgotten. So, to put it gently, it would have to be a pretty special idea from you to meet my exacting criteria. That's not to say I'm not grateful. Your kind of letter is always a pleasure to receive. Please do let me know what you had in mind, but don't be disappointed if I have to be blunt and reject it. That's the nature of the beast with writing. Constant rejection. You have to steel yourself in this game. With best wishes, Monica. P.S. I put my email on my website because I do so love to hear from my readers. It means a lot to me, though you can imagine how much work it gives my poor, very part-time assistant. Goodbye.
Dear Monica, how fantastic to get such a full reply and to hear your voice, as it were. Wow! Your email writing is as compelling as your fiction. I understand, of course, that you may wish to give my idea a wide berth. I rather expect it, actually. It's just that when it comes to obscure and tiny popular movements in British history, I happen to have a bit of form. I was a very amateur historian for many years, while also working in museums up and down the country. The less mainstream the historical event, the more interested I was. The very paucity of information was what spurred me on. There was nothing I liked more than making my own, often serendipitous, discoveries. Your wonderful leading characters have really caught my imagination. I admire how this every pair is so deftly fitted into new settings. The idea has this beautiful elasticity about it, stretching not just their story, but how we view history as a whole. Bloody marvellous. But how did you hit on such an idea? Did it take years of throwing things backwards and forwards in your mind? Or was it a eureka moment? Did anything particularly inspire you? Anyway, my humble suggestion was the clash between the Hesiod racial group and the Radiant Wanderers, religious fanatics, on the Lincolnshire coast in the mid to late 18th century. Are you familiar with this moment in history? Have you already discarded it as useless to you? Then please bin this email at once and we'll call it a day. But just in case, the Hesiods had an extraordinary racial lineage. They were thought to originate from the Pavlodar region of Central Asia and may have had Jewish and Indian roots as well, which apparently made them very striking to look at. Imagine Marianne with long dark hair, brown eyes and a plain white chemise or petticoat. The ones who arrived on our shores were led by a young woman, would you believe? And here's the extraordinary twist. The local religious sect that squared up against them was led by women as well. These two groups constitute just about the only examples of matriarchal society in modern British history, albeit played out on a very small scale. Fascinating and convoluted story. The Hesiods had a revolutionary social setup and a surprising architectural bent. Oh, wait till you picture the bizarre homes they built for themselves. I'll stop here so that I don't bore you any further. I can see that rejection for a writer must be galling, but that you become inured to it. I might be facing a form of literary rejection myself right now. Thanks for hearing me out. I could go on and on about this subject forever. Your most avid reader, Hilary.
Hilary, let's not beat about the bush. I'm quite excited about this. I'm not saying it's something I can definitely use, but it's got promise. That's how everything starts, with the tiniest seed of an idea. But where does one go to find seeds? Sometimes they just drop into one's lap from a passing bird. I must hear more about these striking Amazons and their confrontation with the religious women. You've painted a vivid picture in my mind already. It will probably come to nothing. End in tears. Yours more than mine. I'm used to it. You can have no idea how frustrating this line of work can be. You don't choose it. It chooses you. And then it punishes you for having had the temerity to do so. But come on, out with it. Tell me more. And sharpish, please, so we can move on and forget if it all comes to nothing. Yours, Monica. Thank you, Hilary, whoever you are. We're only back in bloody business.
Hilary was played by Rebecca Charles. Monica by Georgina Sutton. Your Most Avid Reader was written by Bibi Berkey, with sound editing by Mark Lingwood. It was made by Tempest Productions and brought to you with the kind support of Rattlesnake Books, an established seller of books, maps, ephemera, art and curiosities. Rattlesnake Books can be found on Instagram, Etsy, ABE Books and Biblio. Your Most Avid Reader by Bibi Berkey. Hi Monica, here I am. Sorry about the radio silence. Been away, had a lot on. Wasn't sure how urgently you needed my information, but judging by all the emails, quite urgently. Sorry. Your Most Avid Reader, Hilary.
Hilary! There you are. I'd given up on you. It's been nearly a month. I had all sorts of anxieties about having dreamt you. I was keen to hear more about the Hesiads from you, particularly as there's nothing out there about them. God knows I've been searching. You can't just leave me hanging. Gone again. I haven't heard from you since your email this morning. That was nearly 9 hours ago. Are you one of those people who rarely looks at her inbox? It was always too good to be true. You're not the first reader to have come up with a half-baked suggestion. Sorry if that's hurtful. I'm just a bit surprised at you, that's all. I imagine you're off digging through dusty tomes somewhere, doing things the old-fashioned and rather more sedate and civilised way. Not an email kind of person. Such a pace of life is no longer open to me, alas. Anyway, I need to be efficient in my line of work. You have to be when you have constant demands from your agent and editor for new and original work. That's why I'm so neurotic about keeping up with correspondence. And always so anxious. Monica.
Dusty tomes? Goodness me, no. Not anymore. Anyway, local records and interviews were my favourite forms of discovery in those days. Did I mention the most sententious horde of ladies? A Regency group of hell-raising young women, all intellectuals and of independent mind and means, who played the men at their own game. Do you know any of them? Another potential for Marianne, I suppose. I once planned to write a book about them, and of course about my lovely Hesiads, but I just never managed to get that far. Life intervened rather spectacularly. Anyway, writing is, it seems to me, an entirely different discipline to research. I simply meander. I discover. There's an urgency about it, but it's a delightful obsession. I wonder sometimes if I have it in me to do full justice to these discoveries. Whether I could produce stories out of them, I'm not sure. I suspect I prefer the hunt. Anyway, why so anxious? A bad day, if I might ask. Your most avid reader.
Yes, a bad day. Though for no external reason. They happen. I regret that I fall for them every time. Once I'm in bed, I wonder how it was that an old hand like me never saw it coming. Funnily enough, as the daylight fades, so the light slowly returns to me. I can't and don't wish to explain it. Well, I must say, Hilary, I didn't think you could come up with something even better than the Hesiads, of which I must hear more. But your most sententious horde of ladies, what an unbelievably wonderful name. They sound even more up my street, particularly if they can play off another group, a gang of men perhaps. How delicious. You are helping to provide more of the light that I mentioned. Yours, Monica.
But you're a writer, a successful writer, a busy one. Doesn't that sustain you, keep your demons at bay?
I don't wish to talk about it.
Dear Monica, first of all, I must apologise for intruding into your private life the other day. You were right to cut me short. In fact, I felt so aghast I instantly began a new document and consigned to it, mostly from memory, I'm proud to say, the details of the Hesiod story. It still needs filling out, but I hope it's of some use to you. Take it. I'd be honoured if you found it inspiring. I'm a slow typer, which is why you've had to wait so long for this. I like printing things up and then annotating them by hand. I must be alone in still preferring the pen to the keyboard. I know I'm a throwback. My daughter was almost born typing. Yes, you're right. I have no idea how strenuous the act of writing must be. I realise that you're not only having to keep your agent and publisher happy, but also the baying masses. People like me, who assume that your stories tumble out, shiny and alluring, like so many Christmas gifts. But there must be some element of grind to it. So, here we go. Let's get to know the Hesiads. You sure you're up for this?
Hilary, believe me, I'm up for this.
First known mention of the Hesiod ethnic group in England is in the early 1760s on the Lincolnshire coast. The Reverend Alfred Dyson of the parish of Thoresby provides the earliest mention. In a letter to his sister Agnes, he wrote about, I quote, "a party of striking gypsies of foreign appearance who have settled themselves in the woods nearby." That was in February 1761. I've seen that letter. He describes these immigrant women as a peaceful lot, right peaceful, who cling to customs strange to us.
Their women are singers and storytellers and speak of the Virgin, and so must be of the Roman Church, or so I imagine. Their men, who number few, are peevish and paler and of no account. Our parishioners have nothing to fear from these folks, as I have pronounced at my service this last week. But they have grumbled and complained, and they do predict robberies and general evil. I have sought to caution them. But my flock is given to constant perturbation, and foresee danger with the arrival of any stranger to the parish. Our new visitors are constructing houses from wood, which I fear will not go well with the landowner. John has been out to the woods to speak with these gypsies, and reports that they utter our tongue passing well, but with some meanderings. They call themselves Hesiads, or some such, but John may be erring in this report. Do you know of them? You are our most learned one in the family.
I saw this letter while looking through the archives of a church in the Lincolnshire Wolds. I was instantly intrigued and talked to everyone in the village. From there, I visited the local history sections of the nearest libraries in Louth and in Boston, where I discovered only two things. One, a newspaper article written years later, but referring back to, I quote, the well-known troubles between our former Radiant Wanderers Church and the Jewesses of the Hesiod race. Jewesses? Weren't they Roman Catholics, according to the Reverend Dyson? How could such a confusion exist? I supposed that it was down to the nature of a migrant race which can't intermingle with its clearly reluctant hosts. A group of migrants is often isolated. The difference, as we shall see, is that the Hesiods had no intention of keeping themselves to themselves. The only other Boston snippet was a reference in an old land registry. It talked about
a squalid gathering of travelling folk from the east, calling themselves the Hesiods people, who have settled in woods on Mr. Gilbert Cranston's land that is private. Those that are leading the group, several young women, have gainsaid our squire and refused to abandon their settlement.
But then I struck gold. I was shown a small pamphlet written 100 years later, so we're talking about the mid-Victorian times. It was by a woman called Dorothy Metlow, one of those village memoirs kind of thing. It turned out she was a direct descendant of the very first Hesiod leader. Can you believe it? And having read it through, these astonishing women came to life before my eyes. Dorothy lived in Swaby village and liked to chronicle every little happening, which you'd think couldn't have been that fascinating, but actually, all of life is there. I photocopied the whole document. I can send it to you if you want, but here's the relevant bit. You're about to meet someone quite special.
I recall from my earliest childhood visiting the home of an elderly lady called Suzanne, like our Susan, but with an E at the end, who despite her great age was still a beauty of note. Her hair was long and always worn in a single plait, and still contained dark strands, which hinted at the lustre once contained therein. Her eyes were darker than English eyes, just like mine. Suzanne had led the tribe and come with the original settlers from abroad, from Pavlodar, she explained. I had never heard such words and was drawn to her stories time and time again. She lived in an attic room in the home of an old Lincolnshire acquaintance in the High Street, but in summer she repaired to one of the last of the wooden huts that had been built by her people in the Swaby Valley. I went to visit her there once. It was August, and the sky was such a blue that it fair hurt my eyes to cast them up. I entered her hut and smelled at once the timber, as though it had been chopped from the forest the day before. The old lady named Suzanne said to me, "We need wood and must live in wooden homes. We must keep the smell of trees in our nostrils at all times." It struck me as such a peculiar longing. But now, all these years later, I must admit to my own predilection for the musty odour of all things wooden. It is strange, is it not, how these preferences travel down in the blood from who knows where.
Is that enough for the time being, Monica? I don't want to overload you. I could go on about them for hours, but you need to let it all sink in, and to decide whether this is of interest to you. You know what's funny? It occurred to me why all trace of the Hesiads has disappeared. It's nothing sinister at all. It's just that eventually they married the locals and stopped being strangers. Isn't it always the way? Everyday life is the enemy of the researcher. It smooths over the bumps and oddities and erases the anomalies. Mind you, they didn't go quietly into obscurity. They caused all manner of mayhem first, a kind of sexual revolution, which is exactly why I thought they might appeal to you. Your books are always so frank in that regard. Do they? Do they appeal to you, my wonderful, confident Hesiod women?
Oh, they very much do. You can have no idea. No idea.
Well, then next time I'll tell you about the people they ran up against, the Radiant Wanderers. But my hands hurt from typing now, and I have things to do. Oh, what a fantastic feeling. To think all my painstaking research might finally find a home. I'm so grateful to you. This story has to be told, and I can't think of a better storyteller than the gifted Monica Malone to do it. Hilary was played by Rebecca Charles. Monica by Georgina Sutton. The male narrator was Mark Lingwood, and the female narrator, Claire Davis. Your Most Avid Reader was written by Bibi Berkey, with sound editing by Mark Lingwood.
It was made by Tempest Productions and brought to you with the kind support of Rattlesnake Books, an established seller of books, maps, ephemera, art and curiosities. Rattlesnake Books can be found on Instagram, Etsy, Abe Books and Biblio. Your Most Avid Reader by Bibi Berkey.
morning, Monica. And isn't it a glorious one? I do hope I find you well. So, let's dive straight in. The Church of the Radiant Wanderers. Not much information, I'm afraid. They were a secretive lot. Originally, it was led by a man, one Enoch Harrington, a self-styled pastor, somewhat in the American mould, who was never recognised by the Church of England. On his death, sometime in the 1750s, his wife, Emily, took over. She infused the Wanderers with an evangelism that even poor Enoch hadn't been able to muster. The women of the group became dominant. They effectively ran the church and were incredibly successful in raising funds and building some respectability for its name. These days they'd be viewed as crackpots, but then I think they may have been something of a novelty. In a remote area like rural Lincolnshire, they were able to flourish and win quite a big local following, especially among the wives and daughters of wealthy landowners. When the newly arrived Hesiates were in trouble for building on private land, it was Emily Harrington who stepped in and came to their rescue. She allowed them to erect their curious wooden huts on stilts on church property. I suppose she wanted their spiritual custom. The two female leaders got on well with each other for a while, but then fell out over the thorny issue of sex, as far as I can tell. Shall we get back to the Hesiates now? I bet that's what you'd like to hear. And what's sex got to do with it all, you ask? Well, let me just tell you a bit more about who they were. Humour me. It all ties in. I was browsing through the reference section of the public library in Lincoln, minding my own business, when I came across a book called The Westward Movement of Eastern Peoples. It was written by a Dutch ethnographer called Paul van Huyffen in the 1860s. I didn't expect much from it, but it totally came up trumps. He talks about Hesiate race originating in India or Nepal and next appearing in Kazakhstan, before spreading westwards and settling in Holland, England and Belgium. Van Huyffen states that the only peculiarity of this group was in the seeming lack of interest in maintaining any racial identity. Wherever they settled, they instantly set about integrating with the locals until they were subsumed and lost to posterity. He adds that they prized girl children and had an unusually imbalanced, if sinister, gender ratio. Remember Dorothy Metlow? I mentioned her in my last email. She was related to the first settlers. Well, she describes them as pure race of enchanting virgins. It's my belief that they called themselves virgins mistakenly because they were anti-marriage. The Hesiates were all about babies, and girl babies at that. For that, they needed local men. Marriage didn't really come into it. This may be exactly why they fell out with the Church of the Radiant Wanderers. Think of how disrupting it must have been. These carefree foreigners arriving, making use of local sperm, but not prepared to play by the religious rules. So there we have it. The stage is set for two formidable groups of women. On the one hand, a band of travelling foreign beauties. On the other, a sect of influential charismatics with their own land and power. How funny to think of their story playing out in the middle of nowhere. There are so many so-called lost villages around the British Isles. Our story is set in and around one of them, a hamlet called Diston Leyby. It would have been inland from where Saltfleet is now, but long gone. Just like the Hesiates, and indeed the Radiant Wanderers. Are you the one who will bring them back to life, Monica? That's the question. I hope this finds you well, and that by it I might be forgiven for having intruded on your privacy and asked about your mood. I must learn to mend my meddling ways. Your most avid reader, Hilary.
Oh, Hilary, I've just received and devoured your email. I can't get enough of these women. I really can't. Everything you've said is right up my street. Please don't feel you need to ask my forgiveness. It was me who acted badly. I get touchy, and I'm moody at times. I'd like to say that it's a consequence of the pressures of writing, but I've always been like that. The old vicissitudes have knocked me a fair bit. Anyway, I was never a solid kind of person, even as a child. It doesn't mean that I'm not a good friend, or even a helpful member of society. It's just that I feel things rather strongly and find myself very easily gripped by strange ideas and notions. Do you see Marianne as the Hesiod leader, then? And what of Dominic? Please answer me soon, this time. Don't leave me hanging. Monica.
Is this soon enough? I've just logged on and there was your message. I had a feeling that it might be there, but I was a bit worried about what it would say. I thought you might send me packing for such amateurish research. Weren't you an academic once, or had some connection with academia? I thought I read that somewhere. I see Marianne as the daughter of the leader, I must say. That way she has enough of a grasp of English society to make her real, and yet plenty of appealing foreignness as well. As for Dominic, I see him as the son of the bigoted landlord. These mystical virgins should completely bowl him over, bewitch him. Sorry. How dare I make such suggestions? I just got a bit carried away. I can imagine that writers balk at people trying to foist their ideas on them. Originality is everything to an author. Are you insulted by me thinking that any of this would interest you? Your most avid reader. P.S. Got to get my daughter ready for school. We'll be back soon.
Insulted? Grateful, more like. One day I'll tell you about the darkness of my current writing life, about doubts, stagnation, and fear. Yes, these are all served up to me daily by my own psyche. Originality is a funny thing. Of course, every writer wants and intends to produce work that's solely her own. But there are moments when something comes to you, and you wonder where you heard it or read it, and it just becomes enmeshed with your own ideas. It's usually just a tiny thing. A name you rather like, a description of a type of dress, maybe just a conversation with a former friend. But it sparks something in you and leads you down your own tunnel of thought until you come out the other end with a totally fresh reworking. In quality fiction, it is how you write, not what you write, trust me. But if you're willing to help me research certain areas, using your superior knowledge, then of course you would be very noticeably credited for that, if not remunerated. Now, I have a confession to make. I imagined you rather differently to how I now think you might be. It was your name, you see, Hilary. It's rather old-fashioned, and your curatorial career. Oh, and your rather proper yet florid way of expressing yourself. It all painted a picture in my mind of an unmarried lady in her 60s, perhaps with a taste for tartan skirts and those comfortable German shoes. I never imagined you with a school-age daughter. Anyway, Monica.
I can see, I suppose, how you came to that conclusion, but no, you're well off the mark. I'm 39, if you must know, and I have a 7-year-old daughter. But you were right about the unmarried bit. Lena's father is no longer on the scene. I worked for several museum services around the country in my 20s and early 30s before giving up and bringing my young daughter to London, where my mother has a flat, which I now rent. How about you? Married? Kids?
Thrice married, no children. 2 dogs, much loved. 46 and greying. Oh, still married to the 3rd. But only just.
How do you find time to write?
It's the one solid thing in my life. If only I could see stories stretching out into the far distance. But I don't. It's by the seat of my pants, mostly. Something always comes up. But you can see why I have my occasional wobbles. Listen, Hilary, if it's not too much to ask, would you mind also furnishing me with some details about that Regency girl gang you mentioned? I don't know why, but I think they might be as promising as the Hesiod women. And the thought of having yet another plot line to play with brings me enormous relief. God knows, there's nothing else on the horizon. Monica.
Hadn't you noticed? It's nearly Christmas. That's what's on the horizon. And I've got a costume to make for Lena's school play. I'm afraid that's going to have to be my priority tonight. But if you can wait a little longer, then I'll get out all my notes and let's see what we can do. Oh, you'll love them, Monica. A truly inspiring group of female friends. The kind of friendship most of us can dream about. Just hold hard. It's on its way. In the meantime, I remain your most avid reader.
Hilary was played by Rebecca Charles, Monica by Georgina Sutton. Your Most Avid Reader was written by Bibi Berkey with sound editing by Mark Lingwood. It was made by Tempest Productions and brought to you with the kind support of Rattlesnake Books, an established seller of books, maps, ephemera, art and curiosities. Rattlesnake Books can be found on Instagram, Etsy, Abe Books and Biblio. Your Most Avid Reader by Bibi Berkey.
All set. Tea, biscuits, check. Then here we go. Monica, I'm going to start with my main source and inspiration. A collection of letters in a file marked Correspondence, Various, from 1790 to 1808. I unearthed them from the archives while working for Greenwich Museum Services in South London. My job was sorting out old files in readiness for digitisation. Well, you know me by now. I start off doing one thing and soon end up going down various rabbit holes. Lena was around 2 at the time, so I had to rush home to pick her up from the childminder. I remember slinging the file in my bag and taking it with me to read in bed that night. I sat up until the early hours with those letters. I couldn't put them down. They were written by 3 young women called Jane Marville, Eliza Taines and Hester Sampson. I guess they were in their 20s, though they could have been older. Anyway, all unmarried, and all belonging to a club called the Most Sententious Horde of Ladies. It transpired that they weren't a formal unit to begin with, not until Eliza's uncle described them as sententious, and it stuck. They positively gloried in it. They refer to other members, although I only have correspondence between these three. The letters are very neatly written, but hardly ladylike. They're full of fun and bravado and elements of anti-establishment thinking. They lived locally but travelled into central London to attend meetings and parties in a proper club, just like a gentleman's club. It's off Regent Street. I gleaned more information from genealogical records and newspapers. Jane Marville actually had a flourishing writing career, and her work can still be found in the British Library. From what I could tell, Hester had some ambitions in that direction too, judging by references in the letters. They must have had quite a following, because they refer to other girls wanting to join them. I struck gold when I came across an independent reference to the most sententious horde of ladies in a pamphlet dating 1823, which detailed English ladies of note of the last decade. It called them accomplished and gracious, dressed always in most fashionable attire. They remain a discerning and exclusive club for our most learned yet frivolous ladies. And here's the thing. Lord Byron himself was mentioned in that pamphlet, saying that he admired the girls and longed to break into one of their meetings, but feared he might be like a lamb in a cage of tigresses. I no longer have the letters. They found a home in the Museum of London, but I took copies of some of them and can send you details if you wish. Their real joy is the many historical and cultural references. For example, in one letter I recall one of the girls, Hester perhaps, asking the others if she thinks Sarah Siddons should join their club now that she's retiring from the stage. I remember them referring to her as a most elegant specimen or something like that. They fell out, though. Did I tell you? It's very sad. But maybe not for now. Surely you've got enough to think about with the Hessiots. That's me signing off, your most avid reader.
Hello? Is there anybody out there? I can't sleep.
Yes, I'm here. I'm a bit of a late night person. I seem to spend the quiet hours at my laptop, just putting down thoughts, that kind of thing. And shopping, obviously. What's keeping you up?
Life? People? Me? Maybe you're naturally solitary. I thought I was, but I'm not so sure anymore. I can't write without utter silence, but I can't live like that as well. I can't write, Hilary. I can't write.
Yes, you can. We're all assailed by doubts, Monica. All of us, whatever we do. Even if it's just making day-to-day parental decisions. Living in a void means you can't distract yourself from the awfulness of yourself. You know what I mean. We all think the worst of ourselves when we look inside. But I am telling you that you write very well indeed. Is that what you want to hear?
Yes and no. It's good to receive compliments, and I suppose it was what I wanted to hear. Though you could have used a bit more hyperbole. But the truth is, I need to hear something else. Talk about something else. Talk to someone else. There's a hatred inside me for what I do, and for everyone connected with it. It's shackled me to an idea, to a constant process. I can't escape from it. My editor, Carla, is always nagging, in a wheedling, falsely chummy kind of way. My agent is new and detached and entirely driven by money. It's an uneven kind of gift, the literary one. It lifts you high and then drops you from that very height. Listen. I have a terrible truth to tell you. Please, please, don't let anyone know, but I must bare my soul. I can't stand the Clement Street books anymore. I don't want to write them. I hate the thought of starting another one, but the demands are getting louder. I should have shown a synopsis to Carla a month ago. It's not that I couldn't think of a scenario for my characters. My mind just didn't want to. It's like some huge hound sitting in front of an open doorway, and however much I kick it and shove it, it won't move. I'm stuck. It's over. I want to run away from it, but I can't. There's nothing creative in this process. I am merely a machine. It was never meant to be like this.
Monica, I'll attempt to comfort you. Let me. But I don't know how effective it'll be. It's late, and you're lonely and blocked and sad, and you've spent far too long thinking about your wretched state. At least in a busy workplace you can diffuse that sense of imminent explosion. Alone you can't. I'm not with you physically, but we can be grateful to modern technology that I can reach you urgently whenever you need me. First of all, let's forget that you have some awful burden to deal with. Many people would give all they own to have a career like yours. Many have tried, I suspect. Few have succeeded. Do you never take comfort in that? You are one of a tiny, tiny minority of hugely successful writers. Secondly, let's accept that every artist faces this in a world that judges you on commercial success. Maybe that's always been the way. Maybe some artists have simply accepted the compromise. Many have flourished within its confines. Those are the ones you must look to. The writers, painters, musicians who produce beautiful work while still earning well from it and receiving popular accolades. That's not a dirty thing, popularity. You're tired, that's all. You need an escape. Can I help you escape? Can I provide you with some research that might prove useful to your editor and stave off your agent? Give me a week and I'll come up with a synopsis for the next Clement Street instalment. You can put your name to it, I don't care. I hate to hear you in such a terrible place. I'm a restless soul, not creative like you, perhaps, but someone who gets off on getting things done. I have enough of a grasp of Clement Street to know what to provide. You need a break. You need to not think about things for a while. Then you can bounce back with renewed vitality. What do you say?
Oh, Hilary, where have you been all my life? You are so thoughtful, and it's so kind of you to make such a wonderful offer. But I can't accept. I couldn't square it with my conscience if you did so much work. Although I would have paid you, of course. But what if it came out? What if everyone knew that my work was not original?
I'm not going to write the bloody thing. You're going to write it. I'm just going to keep those walls from the door by coming up with a plan for a story. You can shape it the way you like. You'll breathe the life into it, and I wouldn't dream of being paid. Don't be ridiculous. You're the writer, not me.
Are you sure? Are you really sure you don't mind?
Go to bed. I'll put down some ideas just as soon as my daughter's Christmas play is over. It'll be fun. Nice for me to do something with my brain, and nice for you to give your brain a rest. And anyway, it would be a privilege, given that I'm your most avid reader.
Hilary was played by Rebecca Charles, Monica by Georgina Sutton. Your Most Avid Reader was written by Bibi Berkey, with sound editing by Mark Lingwood. It was made by Tempest Productions and brought to you with the kind support of Rattlesnake Books, an established seller of books, maps, ephemera, art and curiosities. Rattlesnake Books can be found on Instagram, Etsy, Abe Books and Biblio. Your Most Avid Reader by Bibi Berkey.
The Women in the Woods, Chapter 1. The women arrived in the night. They walked from the sea, presumably up into the fields in search of woodland where they could settle. But finding nothing suitable, continued into the early hours until they reached the edge of the vast Hindwold estate. Here, not knowing they were crossing into private land, they entered the fields on the southern tip of the estate and boldly bisected the broad pastures. Silent, barely a word passing between them, and witnessed by not a single soul. Everywhere about them were glistening, grey fields, but not the merest glimpse of woodland in any direction. They walked as though they followed a scent or even a buried memory, moving with confident if weary strides, never stopping to take note of the topography. Miles of flat, smooth-seeming terrain stretching to the horizon. Then, as the sun emerged, they dropped down into a glade in the bowl of which was a copse of healthy beeches and hornbeams. This would have to do. The women loosened straps across their chests and dropped their bundles, rolls of carpet containing tools and cooking pots, and removed knives and small axes, and instantly got to work hacking at the thinner trunks around them. As the sun rose, Dominic Hadley sat up in bed. His heart was running too fast, his eyes were open, uncomfortably wide. He'd heard a voice. Someone had said something to him out loud, not in a whisper, as though continuing a conversation, and it had jolted him awake. At 15, he usually slept the impenetrable sleep of the adolescent and never once woke in the night. But now, here he was, wide awake, and sitting up in a kind of personal storm as the voice resonated in his ear. "I'm back," she had said. "I've come back to you." He trembled because the voice was female, but didn't belong to his mother or to his sisters. It was huskier, and he was sure had a foreign accent. He knew it and yet didn't. It made him want to cry with longing. The boy waited and listened, picked up on every creak and groan in that room, but the voice did not return. Eventually he pushed himself back down under the sheet, doubting he could return to sleep. As his head touched the pillow, so a cool hand seemed to stroke his left temple, a hand familiar and comforting. And almost immediately he was dreaming about a past that he could never have actually lived. Dominic Hadley was the heir to the Hindwold estate, his father's only son, a boy on the cusp of expensive responsibility. No one argued with his suitability as the eventual master and landowner. His sisters had no particular love for the estate. His mother was supremely unconcerned with worldly matters, and his father not really a countryman at heart. In fact, the entire family much preferred their townhouse in London on the leafy and pleasant Clement Street, where they woke to the clatter of the milk cart and the cry of the city vendors. It suited them much better than Lincolnshire, where the sky was so wide that you moved beneath it apologetically, like a scurrying beetle. Maybe only Dominic himself had any real affection for their estate, and it was more like respect born from duty. He had stronger attachment to the land than any single other Hadley of his generation. His father, John Hadley, Esquire, was a reluctant farmer. He had inherited the estate from a short line of similar amateur countrymen, who accrued more and more of the countryside without a second thought. If anything caught his imagination about the place, then it was the science of it, the possibility of the land for experiment, and, through that, increase. The knack was to rear a son who would take an interest in farming, but also could remain a little above it. He found for his son a tutor in London, a Mr. Nicholas Rouse, who, by chance, hailed from Lincolnshire. The young man was a scholar of some pedigree, but from an impecunious family. He turned out to be more interested in politics than he was science, and so the relationship was never a comfortable one between father and tutor, tutor and son. Dominic's mother, Anne Hadley, was nearly a foot taller than her husband, and looked down on him and most men from her imperious height. She was striking in face and mind. It seemed sometimes that only the minutiae of theology managed to ignite any degree of enthusiasm in her. Dominic never doubted who actually ran Hindwold. Since infanthood he had watched his father retreat into written words and his mother emerge rather scornfully into the vacated position of authority. Everyone in the family played along with the pretence that John Hadley was in charge or even capable of it. "I shall wander in the grounds today," Dominic Hadley announced to his tutor the morning of his wakeful night. He was in a fever to get out and scour the land for something that he knew to be there. "I think not," said Rouse, with much practised tedium. The boy was listless. That was nothing new. "I shall," said Master Hadley, with rising conviction. He surely didn't have to explain himself. Rouse glared at the boy with his lips pursed and his eyes overhung by angry brows. They stood in this way for a moment, and then the tutor simply shrugged, and the boy left on that signal. He ran from the room and down the great stone staircase and out of the main doors into a world that was far too large for him, and so eternally exciting. Rouse stood at the window and watched, and not for the first time sensed his animosity rise until he could feel it constricting his breath. Whether it was prompted by the boy, his father, this limitless land, or the unfairness of the world, he himself didn't even know. The boy ran down through the parkland that formed the immediate boundary to the house and carried on running into the fields where his father's men were working, bringing water to the crops. The day was hot, and the men's shirts were loose and hanging over their breeches. Though it was still June, the grass was hay and the soil was crumbling. The men stopped, grateful for the distraction as the boy hurtled past and wiped their shining foreheads and rested their hands on their hips. Dominic ran on, convinced of his route, and headed south to the outlying fields where the pigs were housed in a row of cabins well away from the main house, at his mother's insistence. Here his father's farm manager, Nathan Gentle, was passing the time of day with the herdsmen. Gentle trailed off as the boy sped past. "What ails him?" he asked, and the men shook their heads fondly over the impetuosity of young people. But Gentle watched the boy all the same, his curiosity aroused. He saw Dominic duck under the railing that divided the arable land from the beginning of the woodland and watched him disappear into the darkness beneath the trees. At last, Dominic stopped. He had been darting in amongst the trees and stumbled now and again because the ground sloped downwards here. It was part of a hollow known as Fair Spinney. It was a large wooded bowl, far from dense, which meant the sun shone through it easily and was why it was known to be so fair, well, he supposed. Halfway down the slope he heard voices and stopped at once. He pressed his back against a tree trunk and waited for his breath to calm. What was he doing here, now that he had been forced to stop running? He couldn't for the life of him explain why he had come here in the first place. Then he heard it again. Laughter. Women's laughter. And they were singing too, and talking in some low, gritty language that he didn't recognize. The hubbub was coming from down at the base of the hollow, a mere 20 or so feet from where he was hiding behind a trunk. It was ungentlemanly, he knew, to
to spy on others, but it was nowhere near as enormous a crime as squatting on someone else's land. As a rule, nobody ever came here, except, of course, his father's gamekeepers, who regularly patrolled the outer reaches of the estate. Dominic's favourite of his father's employees, the young farm manager Nathan Gentle, was bound to come out this way sooner or later to check for poachers' traps. Then the game would be up for whoever was down there. Enough time had passed. His moment had arrived. Dominic wanted to see who owned these voices, who dared to settle on his father's land. He tipped forward away from the tree, twisted and fell lithely into a crouch. From this position he could see better through the young trunks all the way to the base of the hollow. His eyes rested on a patch of packed earth exposed to the sun, like a small stage waiting for an actor. His heart was in a riot, and he felt ashamed and belittled by spying, and yet he couldn't move. And then she stepped into the sunlight. A woman, odd and beautiful and wrong, entirely wrong for this little English spinney. She was slim but sturdy and dressed in red. Thickly woven linen skirt gathered at her waist. Her bodice was of the same crude fabric, but white-edged, with plain heavy lace at the cuffs and neck. She stood in this sunlit scrap of stage, and Dominic could see that she was resting, that she had held some kind of small axe in her hand. She dropped it and raised her head to the sky and closed her eyes as if imbibing the light. He held his breath. The woman finally tipped her head forward and, as though it was merely part of a routine, raised her hands to her chest, her fingers arriving at the small ties holding the front of the bodice together. Quickly she undid them and removed the bodice entirely, the garment slipping from her shoulders as though it had been torn in two. Dominic was startled when, without knowing that it was even there, he saw a broad black plait drop from behind her head, across her neck and down the cleft of her naked breasts. It too seemed to be resting, fitting perfectly in that valley. Dominic had never seen hair like it, as dark as it, such a mass of it. He couldn't move for marvelling at the sight. She was so beautiful, he sobbed once with surprise. The pain in his eyes was from the strain of longing. He was craving that warmth, that softness. Someone grabbed him violently by the hair at his nape. He called out, and the woods spun round him as he lost his footing. He reached, terrified, for his stinging scalp in a flailing attempt to break free and run away. But the hand held him strongly, and in the confusion he merely brought more agony on himself, to add to his already huge burden of fear and shame. "Please," he cried, "please don't hurt me. I won't tell anyone what I saw."
The male narrator was Mark Lingwood. Your Most Avid Reader was written by Bibi Berkey, with sound editing by Mark Lingwood. It was made by Tempest Productions and brought to you with the kind support of Rattlesnake Books, an established seller of books, maps, ephemera, art and curiosities. Rattlesnake Books can be found on Instagram, Etsy, Abe Books and Biblio. Your Most Avid Reader by Bibi Berkey. Anyone there? Hilary, are you logged on?
Monica, I'm so sorry. I've only just seen your email now. Didn't expect you to write on Boxing Day. I haven't looked at my phone or laptop for days. Were you trying to get away from the TV? Or from your family? I know how that feels. Having said that, we had a pretty low-key kind of gathering this year. General goodwill and too much eating. How about you? How was the holiday season your end?
I was at a screen most of the time. I didn't expect you to be at yours. I just wanted to make contact. Typed into the void. See if anything came back. Never mind. Seeing as you're asking, I spent most of the so-called holiday season in bed. Defiantly. Edward went alone to his family. He's got grown-up children, and they all met at his ex-wife's, where they had a merry little time together. They get on very well, him and his ex. I don't begrudge them their friendship, as long as I don't have to hear a single detail about it. I think he was happy to escape the gloom of our cottage for a while. It's my fault. I don't blame him. There were days I couldn't get up. I put the television on and watched it through my tears. I didn't even have the dogs for company. I made Eddie take them with him. That's how bloody-minded I was. The whole point was to allow myself to suffer. Giving into it makes it come and go all the faster. But anyway, the point is, it's over now, bloody Christmas. And I'm up, and I've had a long time to fester and feel sorry for myself. The suffering's receded a little, I think. I actually reread Sartre's On Writing in between the god-awful soap operas and reminded myself of the pain of creativity, the ruthless drive of it, the huge importance of it. I shan't beat about the bush any longer. I was a bit dismayed by your opening chapter. Shall I tell you why? Because, my dear, it was a bit too good. It seems to have come rather easily to you, this pastiche of my writing. Reading it took my breath away. It should have been enjoyable, but it wasn't. If anyone can do it, I raged, what makes me think that I'm any different or special? That was the tumult you created in me. I hated you. I'm capable of drumming up the most rabid hatreds. And it was all because you had, by fluke, written the kind of opening I was looking for, but couldn't quite reach. So, I have to ask this of you now, to get it out into the open, to clear the babbling in my head. What do you want? What do you want of me? I get a lot of requests from struggling writers who want me to put in a word for them, to use my influence to get their careers started. Is that what you have in mind here? You might as well tell me. We've just galloped along with our correspondence, and, of course, I know nothing about you. But here you are, writing me opening chapters of my own books. Tell me what you want from me, and let's get to the nub of things, shall we?
Oh, my goodness. Oh, Monica, I'm all in a whirlwind now. Oh, I wish I had your phone number so I could call and explain. I'm so sorry. I can't believe I've caused so much trouble. Please believe me that I have absolutely no intention of eliciting your help in getting me published. Absolutely not. I've said it before. You're the writer, not me. This was just a one-off. I got the bit between my teeth. I had no intention of writing a whole book. Good grief, I wouldn't know how to do that. I was just trying to help. You sounded so desperate. That's just me sticking my nose in. It's the way I am. I'm a doer. And now look what I've done. Made you miserable throughout Christmas. Please believe me, I had no such motives. Delete it. Don't let me add to your angst. Whatever happens, whatever you now think of me, I remain your most avid reader.
I just don't know what to think.
Oh, God, don't think anything at all. I'm so sorry. Look, I'll go away. Just forget me, please. Just forget me.
You put me in an awkward position, Hilary. You wanted to help, and you left me feeling very, very low and useless. I reached rock bottom. At the same time, I was getting these irritating calls from my agent and from Carla. They're no respecter of Christian festivals, let me tell you. I was assailed from all sides, even from inside. I was not in my right mind. Do you hear what I'm saying?
Yes, I'm so sorry. I can't believe that I added to your suffering. I'll never forgive myself.
No, Hilary, you don't seem to be hearing me. I had no choice. I was desperate. I had to do something to feed their grasping need for words.
What are you saying?
I'm saying I sent your manuscript to my agent.
Oh, right.
I had no choice. I was in a corner. You can surely see that. Anyone would have done the same thing in my situation. And the thing is, they want the next few chapters within a fortnight, and a synopsis. So, come on. No time for apologies. We need to crack on and produce a bloody good book. Hilary was played by Rebecca Charles, Monica by Georgina Sutton. Your Most Avid Reader was written by Bibi Berkey, with sound editing by Mark Lingwood. It was made by Tempest Productions and brought to you with the kind support of Rattlesnake Books, an established seller of books, maps, ephemera, art and curiosities. Rattlesnake Books can be found on Instagram, Etsy, Abe Books and Biblio. Your Most Avid Reader by Bibi Berkey.
The Women in the Woods, Chapter 2. I counted 17 souls in all, sir. 11 of them full-grown adults and the rest bairns. Nathan Gentle had been called to Hindwold House. His master was in a rare state of excitement, studying new farming methods from books which had arrived that very day. He had no intention of leaving the library. But when his wife said his farm manager was on the doorstep, insisting he see Mr. Hadley urgently about an incident of trespass, he wearily informed her to fetch the man in. Mrs. Hadley led the young man into the library and closed the door, with her on the inside. This piece of estate news seemed vaguely more interesting than the usual dull details about crop yield and weather. John Hadley remained in his high-backed chair and demanded more details from his employee. "Are they mainly male?" he asked. "Do they seem of a dangerous nature, violent perhaps? How many of our men shall I call in from the fields to evict them? Will I need a firearm? We've never faced such matters before." Gentle creased his brows with a moment's consternation. Though strongly built and physically able, he had the reputation of being a little too pensive, someone eternally puzzled by the rashness of those around him. He was an odd choice for farm manager, being sparsely educated and from a family of no account. But Hadley had been impressed by Gentle's agricultural knowledge, and besides, his wife had approved the choice. "That's the odd thing, sir," he continued in the same meditative vein. "I counted only 2 growed men and only 1 boy child. No more than 2 year he was. One of the 2 men, one was old and the other never stirred, while all around him the women and girls toiled." "Toiled at what?" inquired the lady of the house. She'd moved around from the door to stand beside her husband's chair. Nathan looked at his feet. He said meekly that they were felling trees, Mum. "Good Lord!" exclaimed Mrs. Hadley. "Women? Felling trees? How barbaric!" But they were far from barbaric. Nathan had seen her too, her skin exposed to the sun, warming herself as she rested for a moment from her work, as though she were refueling. He had approached the copse after the young master had entered it, thinking that maybe the boy had discovered a poacher. Ending up on the slope opposite Dominic's, he enjoyed a better view of the little colony. He saw the tribeswomen stripping the bark from the cut branches, and the young woman returning to them from sunbathing, her bodice now tied back up. He had watched how she moved among them with the concern and attention that marked her out as their leader. He had hesitated in informing his master about them, feeling that they'd hardly constituted a threat, but he realized he had no choice. "So many women," said Mrs. Hadley. "How peculiar. Do you think they're menfolk who are out poaching on our land?" "I think not, Mum," replied Gentle. "I stayed a while and nobody came nor went." Mr. Hadley was impatient. He had things to do. "Oh, just get them off my land, Gentle. Get the stable lads and the farm hands together and tell these women to pack their belongings and leave. I won't have it. Cutting my saplings to bits, I mean to say. What are they about?" "I'll wager they're making shelters, sir," replied Gentle. "Perhaps we might give them the fallow pasture by the swine field. We could use more hands on the farm, give them somewhere to live in exchange for labour. They seem diligent, if nought else." "Absolutely out of the question," returned Hadley. and he rose from his chair, summoning up the authority to make a speech, but he was stopped by a knock on the door and the arrival of his son's tutor, Nicholas Rouse. "May I have a word, sir, if it pleases you?" Hadley sighed dramatically and beckoned the tutor in. Nathan Gentle wondered if this was the moment to leave. The two men knew each other, and neither liked each other much. There was a kind of acknowledged tussle between them over Dominic's affection, a conflict that represented the boy's own troubled loyalty to both land and to learning. Though the men rarely had cause to meet, when they did come together, they greeted each other through gritted teeth. "I'm a little concerned about Master Dominic," began the tutor. "He's been gone for these 2 hours." "Gone?" said Mrs. Hadley. "Please explain yourself." Rouse glimpsed about the room, giving off an air of victimhood. He was meant to impart learning and not to scurry after truanting boys. "He ran away from the lessons this morning, madam, as though he were on some mission. He was strangely agitated, as I deemed it. I could do nothing to brook his ardour for escape." "You should have, Rouse," she insisted. "He's not to run about the land when he should have been studying. John, I've said often enough that he should be sent to a school. Perhaps now you will give my words some credence." "My dear," began the master of Hindwold, his sentence dwindling along with what was left of his command. His wife continued. "Where did he go, Mr. Rouse? Did you see?" "Fair Spinney," answered the tutor. "I followed him, Mrs. Hadley." "And what was he doing there, pray? What did you see?" What did he see? He'll never forget what he saw. The boy had been a mere 10 feet away, but was not aware of his tutor's proximity as he crouched among the twigs and leaves. But Rouse had barely noticed Dominic, his attention caught by the sight of a young woman walking out into the sunlight. He had watched with amazement as she untied her bodice and let it slip down her shoulders. He stared, just as the boy stared, at the rope of black hair that fell down her chest, and he felt himself grow angrier and angrier. How long had the boy been coming here? Who was this extraordinary-looking woman? Was this a performance just for the lad? Incensed, he turned on his heels and came back up to the house to start the process of getting his young charge into trouble without any injury to himself. But there was something else. As he left, he heard the boy cry out in terror and pain. Rouse had no such stomach for physical confrontation and continued to walk away. Should he admit to what he had heard? Or would that make him culpable if the boy were discovered lying in his own blood, his throat cut by a stranger? "I saw Master Dominic enter the wood. To my knowledge, he has not emerged. That was more than an hour ago." At that, Gentle flashed a look of urgency at his master and mistresses and turned at once and left the room. Mrs. Hadley scowled at the tutor. "You should have come at once. He is but a boy. You may not know it, Mr. Rouse, but there is a band of criminals lying low on our land. If any harm has come to my son, then you must live with that on your conscience. John, rally the men."
Oh dear, this stinks. But I have to fetch Lena from her friend's house. Perhaps you could knock it into shape. How are we doing? How many chapters do you think we can get away with? Do you need a synopsis? Please let me know. Good night, Monica. Your most avid reader.
Hilary was played by Rebecca Charles. The male narrator was Mark Lingwood. Your Most Avid Reader was written by Bibi Berkey with sound editing by Mark Lingwood. It was made by Tempest Productions and brought to you with the kind support of Rattlesnake Books, an established seller of books, maps, ephemera, art and curiosities. Rattlesnake Books can be found on Instagram, Etsy, Abe Books and Biblio. Your Most Avid Reader by Bibi Berkey. Morning, Hilary. Got your chapter? It needs more detail. So far, it's all been action and no setting. We need to inform the reader peripherally about the year, about the geographical location, about what's going on in the greater world. Stories like mine need plenty of explanation. It may seem clunky, but it's expected. If we're going to enjoy any kind of credibility, then we have to hit them with historical fact. That's the way the Clement Street series goes. That's the way historical fiction goes. Also, where's the synopsis? It's very important. I take it that you have a plan and that you're not making it up as you go along. Of course, I ought to add. Thank you.
And a very good morning to you too, Monica. I had rather hoped that you'd do all the filling in. I mean, you're the expert. I can give you more details about the Hesiates and the Radiant Wanderers, but you're the one to make it all readable. Also, I thought perhaps we would hit them with action first, set the scene, and then feed in the historical facts, probably by about chapter 4 or 5. Is that no good? Have I wasted your time?
Well, it'll have to do for the time being. I've sent off the new chapter to Fiona, my agent, and she hasn't complained. I told her I'd written the synopsis, but the file had disappeared from my computer, and I'd have to write another one. For today. Could you do that, I wonder?
Yes, I could try. The only problem is that it's still New Year, and I've had a parade of relatives coming and going from my flat, and my mother's had flu, and I've been looking after her, so I'm a bit up against it. Aren't you all tied up socially as well? I mean, New Year is always such a chore, isn't it?
I've told you already. I don't do family events. I particularly hate New Year. Can't get worked up by it. Such forced jollity. People say it's a time to reflect. I don't see why that would be a joyous pastime. Reflection. For me, it's the pits.
Well, it can't be all that bad. Come on, I'm not having that. Think of all the good things in your life. Your wonderful profession, the best profession in the world, I think. The constant challenge of it and the influence. And then surely, if you reflect on, I don't know, your first marriage, the first time you were in love, your youth, your friendships, things like that, there must be good memories there, precious ones.
Let me explain my first marriage, and maybe that will lay to rest your charmingly buoyant view of my past. I was married quite young, at 23, and I loved him desperately. I suspect that's normal for a 23-year-old encountering love for the first time. We'd known each other at university, but it wasn't until we both lived in London and met regularly among friends that we fell in love. He was the same age as me, very clever, very entertaining. Everything that I felt was worthy of me. I was rather snotty and self-important even then. He was doing a history PhD at UCL, and I was working in PR for a company in the West End. I was quite ambitious, but really just for the sake of it. I'm not sure I was pursuing greatness in public relations particularly. Fairy tale days, those. Handsome young intellectual for a husband, earning well at my own job, meeting interesting people, distant, warming thought of having children someday. I used to go and meet him and his friends at lunchtime in the university canteen. I liked to be with him. He belonged to me. I knew how much they loved his company, how some of his women friends wished they'd got there first. And for a while, that gave me a great sense of satisfaction. He loved me, not them. He married me. But one succumbs to jealousy rather easily at that age, don't you think? I started resenting the presence of his colleagues when I joined him for lunch. Why did they always have to be there? It seemed to me there was a preponderance of pretty little blondes, so sweet and so clever, like performing poodles. Their in-jokes and their academic references irritated me. They relished owning a part of him that I didn't. I started to wonder just how friendly some of those females were. I was certain they were making a play for him, shamelessly, in front of me, as though it were a challenge. I would accuse him, in a roundabout way, of being interested in other girls, and he always denied it. I'm afraid these regular confrontations got to him. It must have got him down, coming home from work each night to my sulking and my semi-accusations. I was young. You do and say some stupid things when you're young. I would say I lost some friends among my first husband's colleagues, but I doubt they ever felt much friendship towards me. Anyway, there's no point beating myself up about it. Within 2 years of our marriage, he had an affair with one of his students, a half-Spanish girl, as I remember. Who am I kidding? I'll never forget her. And I was relieved, because at last I could feel justified. He accused me of driving him away. That's the kind of utter rubbish a philanderer like him would come up with. We parted, and for all I know, he's had it away with any number of his students since. I don't care. I moved to America, where I met a nice young publisher called Ryan, and we lived together until my divorce came through, and then got married at once. So, Happy New Year, me. You did ask.
Whoa. Wow. I'm sorry I pried. What can I say? You'll have plenty for your autobiography, I suppose. You know, and there's no way I could know this, is there? But maybe he wasn't worthy of you. We give our love very freely when we're young and let loose on the world. Without making a bad call now and again, we wouldn't know what quality really was. Myself, I always railed against this learning process, but I'm all right with it now that all is well. I'm sorry New Year is so uncomfortable for you. Of course I'll do you a synopsis, but may I send you the next chapter first? It's in my head, you see. I have to get it out.
Feel free, my dear. Who am I to argue with the creative process? Hilary was played by Rebecca Charles, Monica by Georgina Sutton. Your Most Avid Reader was written by Bibi Berkey, with sound editing by Mark Lingwood. It was made by Tempest Productions and brought to you with the kind support of Rattlesnake Books, an established seller of books, maps, ephemera, art and curiosities. Rattlesnake Books can be found on Instagram, Etsy, Abe Books and Biblio. Your Most Avid Reader by Bibi Berkey.
The Women in the Woods, Chapter 3. The year is 1761, and in the vast, flat, rural swathe of the eastern coast of England, it is early summer. There is a bating of breath to see how the year will go, a hoping of hopes for the imminent harvest to be a good one, God willing. For healthy livestock, for warmth, and for rain, for plenty. The gentry and the yeoman farmers are embracing new methods to pull as much life out of their fields as nature will allow, and then perhaps some more. They follow the Dutch example of planting swedes and turnips to keep their unused fields fertile and their animals satisfied in winter. Always think ahead. They begin to practice a new kind of breeding, where sheep produce thicker fleeces, and pigs gird themselves with more meat. Farming is the thing to do, and Lincolnshire is the place to do it. That's where the wealth lies. The farmers here are men of ideas, and embrace the science of abundance. All they need is space and investment. They work to huge volumes, and still they dream of more. The nation itself is increasing, the opportunities of all men of means burgeoning. The people are teeming, and they are following the opportunities. War is still playing out, but the prizes are great. Canada and India. What about the West Indies? There's opportunity there too. The point is to stay on top of the land, to own it, to get others to work it. Don't let it swallow you and your children. Don't be a part of the machinery called human labour, or else there's nothing, no posterity, no wealth, no point at all. Not everyone is gaining. The thousands who are swallowed by the land are like seeds that fall and grow, then wither and are replaced. There's nothing beautiful about nature, but then nature is a hindrance when it comes to farming. Men like Nathan Gentle, the able young farm manager on the Hindwold estate, are not in love with the process. But they're saddled with an attachment to an older sense of home which will serve them poorly. It's not that they fear to better themselves, it's just they don't know how. Maybe distant escape is the answer, the colonies, but it might be more of the same. They can have no idea that soon they will escape from the fields and become part of a new machinery, the human cogs and wheels that will build great cities and create more rich men to claim their posterity. And men like Nicholas Rouse, the tutor, they too should have their moment. They should be the ones to articulate the beauty of ideas, the value of science. They are the young men who shun wars and question authority. Why should they look on while the rich redraw the boundaries of the land? They will have something to say, and so they should. And then there are boys like Dominic Hadley. They straddle both worlds, the old and the new, and are, as yet, at home in neither. What Gentle lacks is a cause. What Rouse needs is power. And Dominic Hadley can only yearn for what he lost in another life. "Why did you hurt me?" demanded the boy. He was rubbing his scalp and glancing sulkily at his attacker. She was saying nothing. She stood with her hands on her hips, her face dark with self-righteous anger, her lips so firmly compressed that her mouth was barely there. "Speak at once!" Dominic commanded her. Still she was silent. She was about his age, in her mid-teens, slim like him, tall as he was tall. Her hair was loose and dark, her features were fine and sharp. She was wearing what looked to Dominic like his nightshirt, a white linen chemise, tied at the waist with a bright-hued scarf, her bare feet poked from beneath its frilled hem. Without any warning, she dropped down beside him. He scurried back on his hands and feet, his palms itching from a patch of nettles. She followed him, also on all fours. And when he stopped, she stopped, and she eyed him warily. "Tell me what you want. Tell me who you are," he quivered. She inspected him carefully, her face close to his. He wondered what it was about him that absorbed so much of this girl's attention. When she spoke, it was merely one word, and that one word was a question. "Dominic?" she asked.
The male narrator was Mark Lingwood. Your Most Avid Reader was written by Bibi Berkey, with sound editing by Mark Lingwood. It was made by Tempest Productions and brought to you with the kind support of Rattlesnake Books, an established seller of books, maps, ephemera, art and curiosities. Rattlesnake Books can be found on Instagram, Etsy, Abe Books and Biblio. Your Most Avid Reader by Bibi Berkey. Chapter received with thanks. Read, tidied up and forwarded. Is the synopsis on its way? This is not standard practice to drip-feed chapters to one's agent, but they seem grateful for anything they can get. And the feedback is quite good, actually. Monica.
Hi, Monica. In that case, can I leave the rest to you now? I'm sure you're brimming with ideas to take it from here. I'm a little out of my depth. It's daunting to think of how much work goes into writing fiction. They say everyone's got a book in them, but I seriously doubt it. It's a three-way split, isn't it? Inspiration, discipline and luck. I don't know what the ratio is, though. Anyway, your most avid reader.
You don't mention talent in your little writer's trinity. Is that because you don't believe it? You think that what separates success from the lack of it is not an intrinsic ability, but luck and labour?
Possibly, I don't know.
I must ask you again, Hilary. What do you want of me? Am I your route to getting somewhere? Am I going to discover soon enough that you demand your name on this book?
No, it's all yours. I have no such ambition. I don't wish to gain financially or professionally from it, and to be honest, I don't wish to write any more of it. Although I've pretty much worked out the plot.
I mentioned how I ran off to America, didn't I? Well, I went with nothing. I'm not talking about money. I had considerable savings and some little family wealth, and so I wasn't destitute. And anyway, I carried on using the marital joint account for ages before my idiot ex noticed. And he didn't do anything about it once he did. No, what I mean was that I had no aim. When I ran away, I thought perhaps it would be romantic just to drift and see where I'd wash up. But that's not me, not really. I was trying to ignore reality for a while, and it didn't work. Within weeks of arriving in New York, where I stayed in my half-sister's tiny apartment, I was panicking because I had nothing ahead of me. Didn't have the stomach for PR again. I knew I wouldn't be able to impress anyone sufficiently, and that was just too awful a thought. I'd do something else, I decided. Something new, and do it well. But not knowing what made me desperate, and there was a kind of wild restlessness in me. I felt like everybody owed me an apology about myself. You once asked me where I got my idea for the Clement Street series. Well, it kind of grew in my head, via an offhand comment from some long-forgotten conversation. It had nagged me for years. It was coming through all muffled, not fully formed. There was something missing, possibly my own confidence in making something of it. Anyway, my half-sister Laura kept inviting me out on double dates, as they call them over there, probably in a bid to get rid of me. I don't blame her. What a gloomy presence I must have been. Then one night I blew up at her and told her that I was fed up with being introduced to one New York banker after another. She protested that she was only trying to help, and I said that she was picking all the interesting ones for herself and leaving the dross for me. Like who? She demanded. Like that editor chap you've seen a couple of times, I said. You know, I actually saw her face fall, not just a figure of speech. It was because she knew me, and she sensed that I wanted him and that I wouldn't stop until I got him, and she'd have the unpleasantness of battling with me over him. She's not the sort to do something as unseemly as fight over a man, my dear lamb of a sister, and so she gave way, even though I knew she rather liked him and thought there was some potential there. And so I had to put my money where my mouth was, and I found it rather easy to seduce him, and, well, at least I didn't throw him aside or anything. That would have been insulting to Laura. I stuck with him. This, of course, is Ryan I'm talking about, my husband of 2 years. In many ways, I blame Laura that I married him at all. I'd felt so guilty about her sacrifice that I dredged up more enthusiasm for him and for our relationship than either deserved. And he was such an American-looking chap as well, you see. All lantern jaw and huge teeth, acne-scarred, and with really very thick golden brown hair. A lovely, enthusiastic, sexually obsessed young... Well, he was like a hound, really, if one must describe him in a pictorial way. A good, big, sleek sort of hound. What I haven't mentioned yet is that he got the whole book thing off the ground. You see, I was a very keen reader of women's writing at the time, and by that I don't mean anything too literary. It was everywhere. Those middle and low-brow books were pitched just right for women in my condition, who needed to be distracted from their own squashed dreams. We craved a very simple salvation, nothing too profound, just an outcome where we were found to be good and beautiful and, above all, right. Ryan's publishing house was making a fortune out of these writers, and we would talk often about my idea for a historical series where the chase is always the thing, because the happily ever after is an empty sham that no one believes, and the chase would take place over centuries, backwards and forwards, where the lovers would yearn for each other and yet would never quite reach each other. Meanwhile, around them would play out fascinating moments in British history, enmeshed with subplots of all the usual love, sex, power, etc. Ryan was bowled over, not really by the plot, but by the fact that it was such a ready-made series. With his help, I ground out the first one. A very good editor in his department helped me rework it. My God, but I was keen and willing to learn in those days. And I discovered, after much effort and crushing of the ego, that actually I could do this. I could write a book and make this series happen. Well, my dear, when you have a major publishing house on your side, if not in your bed, there's nothing a writer can't do. In the 2 years that Ryan and I were together, I wrote 3 books with increasing independence. The third was virtually all my own work. One day I said I had to go to London to research a new plot, and once there I emailed him to say I wasn't coming back. He was terribly stung, poor thing, but I knew it was right. He was a good man, and he has a lovely family now. 2 daughters. I've visited them and find his children delightful, if a little too proper. Maybe I'm just too inclined towards those with flaws. I'm too quick to criticise the seemingly perfect, but those who are difficult, problematic, annoying, selfish, boring, well, I can find some fellow feeling there. I'd consider you one of those tediously unselfish types too, if it weren't for the fact that I sense you might have a bit of an ego too, and you're just not letting on. It's the mystery about you that makes me relax about this whole enterprise of ours. I don't care what awful motivation drives you. I feel at home with the awful. Which brings us to payment. Please don't say that the work is its own reward. I won't believe it, and it stinks as an idea. Art should be paid for, shouldn't it? Anyway, it's not bloody art. But how should I reward you, if not in cash? I think I know. You claim you are an avid reader of mine, the most avid, and so I deduce that correspondence with me is the reward you crave. And facts about my life are the payment you have been receiving, and shall continue to receive. Am I right? Have I hit upon the perfect equation? You help me write this book, and I'll pay you with, well, with me. Hilary was played by Rebecca Charles, Monica by Georgina Sutton. Your Most Avid Reader was written by Bibi Berkey, with sound editing by Mark Lingwood. It was made by Tempest Productions and brought to you with the kind support of Rattlesnake Books, an established seller of books, maps, ephemera, art and curiosities. Rattlesnake Books can be found on Instagram, Etsy, Abe Books and Biblio.